Hello and welcome to my Flosstube channel. My name is Jacob and I am the owner and designer of Modern Folk Embroidery. You're probably wondering how I have done so quickly after my previous video a new one, but I felt I really should put this one out finally now as I've been teasing it for such a long time. I had a chat with the wonderful Dorothee Kandzi a couple of months ago, and I have been wanting to present this to you a couple of months ago actually, but every time I did a YouTube video they turned out to be too long to include the chat that I had, and then today I recorded the video that I uploaded. Well, when you watch it now it will be yesterday's video, and I felt that that video again was getting way too long with the chat, and I wanted to do justice to Dorothee's wonderful knowledge that she has, so I thought, like, I'll do it in one dedicated video. So finally today I present to you the chat I had with Dorothee. I'll introduce Dorothee a little bit to you if you don't know her already. She is a wonderful a source of knowledge about samplers, and together with Ute Scheer, she runs the Werkstatt für Historische Stickmuster, which translates loosely as the workshop for historical embroidery. This is in Germany, and their website is also in German only. I will link to it in the drop down box. So even if you wouldn't be able to understand exactly the website writing, probably Google could translate it for you, and it's worth looking at the beautiful pictures anyway. Dorothee also has, together with her son, a wonderful app that they launched last year called the Silk app. I am one of the designers on it, which I'm very honored to be on. Dorothee's patterns are on there, as well as a whole host of wonderful and talented designers, so it's definitely worth checking out. That is a app available on the Apple platform, so on iPads and iPhones only at the moment at least. The chat that I had with Dorothee was actually the result of a question that I got from one of you, the viewers, asking me what the differences and similarities between German samplers were. So I thought, who better to ask and to sit down with than Dorothee Kandzi. So let's have a look at our chat now. Hello, Dorothee.
Hello, Jacob.
Hello. It's very nice to have you today. So I got in touch with you because one of the viewers was commenting that they were wondering about the similarity or the differences between Dutch and German samplers. Now, of course, people see some samplers and they go like, oh yeah, there's a lot of similarities between some samplers, but of course Germany is such a big country and there's such a variety. So are there similarities or are there really great differences? And I thought, like, who better to sort of talk about German samplers than Dorothee? So what would you say? What are the big similarities and what are the big differences between the two different countries, would you think?
First of all, I think you should mention that in European samplers, in Europe, samplers appear in almost all countries and in all religious communities at the same time. There must be a kind of need for collecting patterns. And the motives of the samplers were basically the same everywhere. So if you want to, or if you see special features of regional nature, you have to look for the design of the sampler, for the size of the sampler, the format, the composition. And I think the same is that the samplers always show a strong religious feeling. And of course, they show a belief in symbols. That is, I think, quite typical for the centuries, from 16th century, 17th century till the 18th century.
Yes, and when you say that they are religious, because we are looking in a really tumultuous religious period the whole religious landscape suddenly changes and you get like a proper distinct northern belief system and a sort of a more Catholic southern belief system. Does that reflect in samplers at all?
Of course. Like I said, the variety of samplers in Germany is huge. And why is it like this? Germany was no nation until 1871. Germany consisted of kingdoms, of principalities, of proud and free cities, and was split in so many small territories, all of which had their own money, cultivated their own tradition, spoke their own dialects. And that means northern Germany, the coastal region, and the northern German islands were much closer to the Netherlands in custom and in ways of life, for example, than there were to Bavaria, whose dialect they even didn't understand. They were seafarers like the Dutch, and in parts they even spoke a common language, Frisian, which was spoken from the River Rhine at Rotterdam to the Elbe at Hamburg. And of course, they were Protestants. So the northern Germany were very near to the Dutch, and they had little in common with the Catholic southern Germany. And that's what you see on the samplers. The samplers in southern Germany were at this time long and narrow. There were very opulent, very Baroque patterns. And the samplers in northern Germany were small and narrow. There were small rectangles, sometimes even squares, like the Dutch samplers, much smaller. And of course, they correspondent with a Protestant way of life. They have many, many religious motives on the sampler, and even motives of the Old Testament, which is very typical for the Protestants.
Yeah, and what I've noticed as well, which I always find quite an interesting distinction between sort of German, Dutch, sort of European samplers and, for instance, English samplers, is that the English use a combination of sort of imagery, but lots of text. There are the alphabets, but then there are lots of verses, especially the English samplers. But we don't see that very often on European samples where there's huge verses, do we? It seems that there is more a symbolic language with images where instead of having a verse, you would see just a depiction of an idea. Is that true, or are there a lot of samples with verses in German?
Of course, no. We don't have in Germany lots of samplers with verses, and we always have the alphabet and lots of motifs. Alphabets and motifs on one sampler. In the Dutch sampler, often there are often two samplers, one with alphabets, one with motifs. In Germany, this is always on one sampler, and we don't have that much text. We don't have verses. The verses in Germany came up in the late 19th century, and they were often stitched. It was very late. I think that it started in 1870, and always verses which
sort of domestic rhymes, or?
Yes,
yeah,
that's it.
We see them here as well.
They have it in the cupboards in the kitchen, but the verses we see on English samplers, or then on American samplers as well, they do not exist on German samplers.
No.
And I think the samplers of the German samplers, the Danish samplers, the Dutch samplers have so many more motifs. They are so more vivid than often the English samplers or the American samplers, because there the place is used for the verse.
Yes, and I think the only samples that we have in the Netherlands which are old, which have verses, because the Dutch like their sayings. We have sayings for everything. Lots of proverbs and sayings, but the only ones that you see with a saying are not like traditional samplers. There's some people call them a sampler, but they are more like a useful object that would have a saying on it. And usually they were something to do with the reason why the object existed. So for instance, there are examples in Friesland of something called a knot cloth, and a knottendoek, they call it, which was a stitched square, which had sort of several corner motifs that you do see on the Frisian samplers. And then it would have a little verse in the center and one of the square motifs in the center as well. And some
yeah, I know that.
words relating some old sayings about marriage. And because the cloth was actually used with coins in it, and if the potential groom would give it to the potential bride, and if she liked the groom, she would make the knot tight, so tying the knot. And if she didn't, she would loosen it and give it back to him again. So it was a sort of an acceptance or a rejectal of a marriage proposal. And usually the saying would be on there as well. And it was sort of like a saying to do with marriage and with marriage life and being a good couple to each other, something like that. But for the rest, we don't see them either in the Netherlands. It's only much later, in the very late 19th century, but especially the 20th century, when you see own home is worth gold, and some little east-west home is best, that kind of sort of sayings, but nothing.
Yes, and these sayings are not of religious nature.
Exactly. Yeah, they're all domestic, sort of just.
They are domestic, everyday sayings. You find it on cushions and on small borders to fix at the cupboard or something like that. So you see it every day in the kitchen. They stitched it on towels, sometimes on tablecloths, but we don't find it on samplers.
And what I have been wondering about as well, because I know that a little bit about the Dutch samplers, is the link with traditional costume and the sampler. So when you look at the area around the sort of what used to be the sea that we had, the Zuiderzee in the Netherlands, which is now Big Lake, there is a distinct sort of style of clothing that, especially in Marken, people would wear with what some would call Quaker patterns. So in Sietmacher's beautiful book from 1597, there are little patterns like these, which look very like Quaker samplers and like Frisian samplers, but they also look like the patterns that they actually stitch on Marken, on their collars and on the boards and stuff. And they would also be featured on their early samplers, not on the later ones, because it sort of just vanishes and it becomes more like a generic Dutch sampler in the 19th century. But in the 16th, 17th centuries and 18th, it's still very local to what people were wearing. Do you see that in Germany as well?
It's the same in Germany. They all have their own local traditions. And of course, it was a need to stitch those patterns, because the clothes were handmade, and it really vanishes when the industrial production starts. In 1850, the industrial productions concerning clothes start, and there wasn't a need anymore to produce themselves by yourself. The women didn't have to sew any longer, and of course they didn't had to stitch any longer. So it was just a need out of time that these patterns were collected on samplers for later use for clothes.
Yeah, and of course the mental shift as well of countries changed, where in the 15th, 16th, 17th century you belonged to a village, While in the 19th century, suddenly there is the identity of belonging to a nation, which is suddenly much stronger than before, where, of course, you still belong to that village, but you sort of belong to like a greater nation as a whole.
Yeah, it's the same in Germany. So the large cities are more global. They had many, many contacts to other cities. But if you look for isolated area, for example, the Black Forest is a perfect example. They kept their traditions until the 20th century.
Yes.
And you really could tell a village according to the clothes and the stitchery the women did.
Yeah, it's still up into the 21st century in some regions in the Netherlands where people still wear the traditional costume. Staphorst, I think, is pretty much the only, well, one of the very, very last towns in the Netherlands where just a very few, I think especially women, still wear the shoulder caps, and it's quite amazing. But yeah.
You find in East Germany some regions as well where they still wear the old clothes for special events, for Christmas, for Easter,
Exactly.
and so on. And of course, by when they marry.
Yeah, but when you really look at the main difference between Dutch and German samplers, for how I look at them, I always think that the German samplers are still much more belonging to a slightly, well, at least a lot of the German samplers that I have seen, because I think they must be from the southern regions as well. They have much more of a Biedermeier style influence, where it's a little bit more opulent and a little bit more floral and a little bit more ornament in the sampler itself, where the Dutch one seems to be a little bit more restrained in their ornament and their depiction of stuff.
Yes, I think they are a little bit modest or a little bit humble, perhaps to say, and I think that has to do with the Catholic and the Protestant way of looking for life. And in the Catholic regions, the samplers are very opulent, very colorful, very, very lush. But I think there is another reason why the samplers are so bright, so beautiful, so opulent. Germany is the only country where very well-known artists and engravers made patterns for cross-stitchers, like Johann Siebmacher. I think Johann Siebmacher is the most popular one. You have the facsimile from 1597. In 1597, Johann Siebmacher came up with a woodcut. It is still a woodcut, right?
Yes.
And these patterns were so popular, so that he released in 1601 the next book, and that was published as a copper plate. And Johann Siebmacher really marks the transition from Renaissance to Baroque era. And the motifs are so beautiful, they were spread all over Europe. However, the printed book was very expensive. Usually the motifs were embroidered from another sampler, and so they really began their triumphal march through the whole of Europe, and being passed from woman to woman, from mother to daughter, from girl to girl, and they wandered from one sewing basket through to the next.
It's just fascinating how tremendously far the pattern spread in a relatively brief period. When you look at it, how quickly they ended up in the Netherlands and then found their way into England and Ireland at one point, where the Quaker samplers were some people.
Yes, from there to the New World. So from one continent to the next continent. Yeah. And but Johann Siebmacher was not the only one who made pattern books for stitchers. It was Peter Quentil and it was Johann Schönsberger. They all worked in the 16th century. And of course, then we have the first woman who engraved patterns with Maria Sibylla Merian. And she engraved beautiful flowers. So her patterns also were really stunning and were very, very popular. And she's the one who started what we call flower baroque, the wonderful flowers of the Baroque time. She, as a woman, traveled, which was very uncommon at that time. She traveled to Suriname. She made wonderful copper plate engravements from all the flowers and she saw there. And the nice thing is that she, as a woman, made patterns for her fellow women.
When we kind of look like the north of Germany, as you mentioned, there is much more similarity between the North German samplers and the Dutch samplers. So this is one sampler that people who have been watching my channel will be familiar with. This Heike Hazelhoff. But it is beautiful with the very strict 2 vases here, 2 vases here, 1 big vase in the center, and of course the little flying angels, which we see on loads and loads of Dutch samplers and German samplers as well. And of course,
on German samplers as
here,
well.
Exactly, and even here, of course, little religious references again, the little cockerels here. What fascinates me is how close this style of sampler that was produced in a period about 70 years in Groningen. It is very close to the samplers of the Vierlande, of which you have been talking beautifully with Caroline of the Grid work on her Flosstube. I'll link to that here as well below in the description for people to check out those videos. And you have talked a little bit about the origin of the Groningen sampler as well, but could you maybe, for those who haven't seen it yet, talk a little bit about the similarities and the origins of the Vierlande in relation to the Groningen samplers?
The outstanding thing about the Vierlande sampler are that they are stitched in black as well. That was very uncommon at that time. Of course, people were fascinated of colors. We can produce every color we want today, but these natural colors are difficult to create. And if they had beautiful, bright colors, they of course were fascinated. And in the Vierlande, they started to stitch only black samplers. The Vierlande is a small area in the south of Hamburg, and there are only 4 little villages. They belong to Hamburg since 1686, and they stitched these beautiful samplers. I think I have somewhere nice picture. This is a classical Vierlande sampler, and they were stitched from 1770 till 1850, and they have really an extraordinary charm because they were stitched in black. You look much more on the single motif when it's in one color, and you don't have to look and for so many colors. And they are always have, I think, 3 elements. the rosette, the rhombus, and of course the tree of life. And what you showed on your sampler, of course, it's nothing else than a tree of life. The tree of life can be placed in a vase like on your sampler. The connection between Groningen and the Vierlande is, I think, quite easy. The Netherlands were always threatened by the sea and storm surges, and so were Hamburg. And the Dutch have always been experts in building dikes. And the 4 villages of the Vierlande, they lie directly on a bend on the river Elbe. And Hamburg has repeatedly experienced devastating storms in which the water of the North Sea were pressed into the river Elbe and threatened Hamburg and the surrounding area. So they had to build dikes, and what could be more natural than to ask the Dutch with their expertise. And the Dutch built the dikes near Hamburg. And I think the workers and engineers, they came with their women, they came with their daughters, and they brought, of course, sewing baskets with them, with wonderful black samplers in their sewing baskets. And there could be a strong connection between those traditions in sampler making.
I think it's very likely, but I have been wondering, because the dikes, they were built in they sort of in the mid 18th century, are we looking at, isn't it? And the mid 18th century, the Groningen samplers were not yet black, but in Vierlande, it's a little bit earlier, isn't it, the black sample? So I have always been wondering, like, maybe the Vierlande started the black trend, and actually the Dutch took it back to.
Of course, that's possible. But the first Vierlande samplers were not black; they were colorful.
Yes.
The first Vierlande samplers we see in 1817, they had a main color, but they had also some colorful spots. So we have Vierlande samplers in blue, we have Vierlande samplers with red spots, with red floss in between. So the way to only black sampler was quite a long way. They didn't start immediately with black samplers. I think they noticed that ornaments they stitched are so beautiful and that they are more impressive when they are stitched in one color than in several colors. That might be a reason too, to switch to black, but they switched to black not in 1817. They switched to black perhaps not in 1717. They switched to black in the year perhaps 1800, 1810.
Yes. So that is around the same time as the Groningen samplers become black as well, because the samplers before that in Groningen also were more colorful. I don't have a Groningen sampler in color, but I recently purchased a sampler from Hoorn, which is in Holland, so it's quite a distance from Groningen. But the layout of that sort of Dutch sampler with the little angels right at the top here, the little vases on the sides, is nearly identical to Heike's black sampler, except that this one is in color, and Heike's sampler is very neatly worked in full black. And I have been wondering as well about the sort of reformed mindset of people, where perhaps because of course these people were quite rich, the Groningen farmers, they were very rich. They had trade, they had access to the embroidery shops of Amsterdam and the big cities. Their daughters would travel, they could get all the colorful flosses they wanted if they wanted to get them. And they themselves wore very fine stitching as well. Black was very fashionable, a lot of the communities, you see a lot of really beautiful black fabrics. Even the embroidery on the fabrics is black for both men and women. But I have been wondering as well, is that perhaps a religious aspect as well, to let's not get overboard with this, like let's not show off too much of our wealth, but keep it very sober. And because of course that might be an aspect that you would expect that nearly to be written down somewhere as well, if that had been the case. So it's, yeah, it's, what do you think of that?
Sometimes it's just a matter of fashion, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yes, we always think about, or we think very, very deeply about these things. Perhaps it's just a matter of fashion. And we know something like polygenesis, that the same thing appears at two different places at the same time. Yes. Because the people just realized at the same time how fine it was to stitch only black, how effective it was, and how good looking it was. So I'm not sure about the reason.
Yeah. The last thing I want to ask you, because this has been really interesting, and I have been asked this question as well by people, and I have wondered it for a long time myself. When we look at the samplers from the 16th and 17th centuries, there is still a very religious mindset, and everything that was stitched had a meaning. It had it was deeply meaningful to the stitcher. When we look at the 19th century, however, we still see those very old symbols. Like some of them are literally hundreds and hundreds of years old, sometimes even older. In how far do you think would the girls have been aware of the symbolism that they were stitching at this time? Would they just be copying the pretty little birdie and the whatever they had? Because when you see, for instance, a monkey at a spinning wheel on Dutch sample, which is a very famous motif, I think the early girls would have known exactly that spinning monkey represented foolishness and or laziness, or because a monkey is something that reproduces something and but is also a foolish character. Would the girl in the 19th century who happily copied that same motive from her mum's sampler, would she still have had that knowledge, or would she just be copying a nice...
I think it really depends on the motive. So the monkey, for example, is something special. The monkey is spinning, and he's spinning the thread of the world. So if the thread of the world is spinned by a monkey, the world is in totally disorder. So I think this is quite a difficult motive to explain to a young girl. But I think what they really knew exactly are all the religious symbols, because they were very familiar with the Bible. And concerning the religious symbols, the girls knew what they stitched. I'm quite sure, because it's the paradise, it's the holy Jerusalem, so many motifs from the Old Testament, and of course Joshua and Caleb with the grape, the both spies who went to Canaan to see if the land is fertile and come back with this huge grape. So I think that's those motifs were very, very well known by the girls.
They were very much storytelling.
The motifs which go back to the antique, like the ape, which with the spinning wheel. I think in the 19th century, really these motifs were just stitched because they saw them on other samplers and really lost their meaning for the single girl.
Yeah, I think so, because you can also see a shift where, for instance, the Dutch maiden, which is such an important motive on Dutch sampler, we see her here on this one. So this is the Dutch maiden here, and that's sort of representative of the Dutch garden. And she has a stick, and on it she has a hat. And that's the hat of freedom, because it was sort of, we were a free nation, and the Dutch maiden is sort of representative of the Netherlands and the Dutch freedom that she has earned with that hat on a stick. I also have a sampler where there's a little bird on the stick, which made me really wonder, did she just sort of think like, I don't like that hat, I'm just going to stitch a pretty bird, and completely lost the meaning of that particular motive, which sort of, that's really what I think, like, where only if you have a bit of knowledge of the subject, you will recognize that as a Dutch maiden. But for a girl sticking it and copying it from her mother's sampler, and her mother did not tell her what that actually meant, it would have just been a little lady with a hat on a stick, and she'd be like, I don't like that, I'm going to stitch a pretty bird on that. So it's quite brilliant how the meaning just changes from a deeply symbolic into a pretty ornament, isn't it? And it's quite difficult for us to determine where symbolism sort of ends and where it becomes an ornament.
Yes, and you really have to differentiate between the single motifs. So all these religious motifs which were stitched in northern Germany, it was, the samplers were called the Bible of the poor, because they really stitched motifs from the Old Testament, they stitched motifs from the New Testament, and they had a whole Bible with all what the Bible says in a small sampler. And of course, these motifs were explained, and perhaps even in school. But of course, there are other motifs which are much older and much more difficult to know about. And of course, motifs changed.
Yeah, fantastic. I want to thank you, Dorothee. It has been really lovely having a little chat with you and to hear your insights about German samplers and Dutch samplers. You're a really wonderful source of knowledge. So thank you so much for being on my Flosstube today.
Jakob, I thank you. It was a wonderful chat, and I hope my English was good enough. I'm not such a fluent speaker as you are.
No, it's perfect, honestly.
I hope it works.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you. And that was the chat that I had with Dorothee. I really hope you enjoyed our chat and that you learned something from this remarkable needlewoman. So yeah, if you did enjoy it, give it a little thumbs up. Make sure to hit subscribe. Check out the links to Dorothee's shop as well, and to the Silk app, which you can find on your iPhone or iPad. I want to thank Dorothee again for sitting down with me. It was really lovely chatting with you, and I want to thank you all for watching today. So I hope to see you next time again. It'll be a bit longer, I guess, than this one, but I won't try and will not make it too long a wait. Anyway, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and look after each other. Bye-bye.